Hello everyone, this is Colin once again. I just made a video. I'm recording two videos back to back on this channel. The first one was regarding Farhan Qureshi and his apostasy from Islam, and him and I have been he actually responded to my video and the video and posts of a couple other people, and he posted an article in response to us talking about his situation, and I made a response to his response. So if you're interested in seeing that, I have the link for that video in the more info section. This video is entitled a response Freud, and I am responding to a private message I received from an individual user here on YouTube named Giganobo is the person's screen name, and they sent me a private message about subject title which read Freud, and the person basically asked me about my questions about my criticisms of Freud, and apparently they are studying psychology, and this person, wherever they are studying, says they need to pick whether to go into psychoanalysis or cognitive psychology, and that the person's been reading Freud for years now and agrees with a lot of what he states. He finds it strange that his ideas are not widely accepted. Due to the controversy around Freud, he says he spent, I'm sorry if this is a woman, I apologize, this individual, excuse me, has spent, during the controversy about Freud, has spent a lot of time looking into the criticisms about him. He finds philosophers and people who talk bad about Freud because their mentors say so, and people who simply haven't read or understood Freud. At this point, he says he or she feels that they're heading towards a Freudian direction, but they have doubts due to the controversies and the criticisms, etc. Then they asked me, could I tell them why I don't go for Freud's theory, and help me make my decision at the end of my solid. Excuse me, I'm reading their private message. Help me make a decision. They don't want to end up making 2 years later finding out that they don't agree with Freud anymore. Well, the good news is that I can say that even if you choose to go into psychoanalysis, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to implement psychoanalysis exactly like Freud taught. Or at least how he expected people to. I would probably say that not every Freudian therapist who uses Freudian psychoanalysis uses psychoanalysis exactly to the letter that Freud did in his life. Now, having said that, it is a tough decision. What school of thought in psychology do you, if you choose to emphasize, which one do you go with? I will say that you will probably I know that based on the abnormal psychology class that I just completed this semester, we found some scientific research that stated that every single type of therapy works. It just depends on the situation, the problem that a patient is going through, and some patients tend to work better in certain schools of thought. The most popular school of thought is eclectic, which means that you use all schools of thought or all types of therapy. And you use whatever one calls for whatever the situation calls for. Excuse me. So the second one, from the percentages we saw of like practicing therapists and what school of thought they adhere to, the second most popular was psychoanalysis or analytical. So in other words, Freudian and Jungian is in second place, and I believe third place, if I'm not mistaken, was cognitive. So really, it's a tough decision to make, but know that no matter what you go into, you can help individuals. If you get licensed to be a therapist, you don't necessarily have to use psychoanalysis for every single patient that you have or client that you have. Now, having said that, why don't I agree with Freud? In a nutshell, to cut to the chase, I do not agree with Freud 100% because of his narrowness of his opinion of what makes up the human psyche and human nature. His reduction that human nature is dependent upon the absolute unconscious foundation of drives that mainly has to do with sexuality, until he later on added aggression and death as drives to the human psyche. I believe that his forceful attempts at putting these drives into the foreground of the human psyche is quite evident when one understands the nature of dreams and the nature of symbols as they have developed in human history. I also, with all due respect to him, believe that he was not as well read as some of his colleagues, i.e., for example, Carl Gustav Jung. In other words, Freud never traveled outside of Europe. He never really was into reading the philosophical works and comparative religious works of individuals that would have led him to the conclusion that symbolism is a lot larger of a field than simply reducing it to a Oedipus complex or to sexuality or aggressive drives. He was very influenced by the idea that essentially we have animalistic instincts, and that those are the driving unconscious force that make up our personality. Now, having said that, is psychoanalysis, can it be applied today? Yes. Another thing I learned in my abnormal psychology class is that psychoanalysis has stripped away, most mainstream psychoanalysis has stripped away this emphasis on sexuality, or this emphasis that these particular drives are the only thing that drive someone's psyche and their personality, and therefore influence their lives. What they've done is they've reconstructed psychoanalysis to simply focusing on the id, ego, and superego of the psyche. In other words, the relationship between these dynamics. And when someone is suffering from a certain issue or certain mental illness, it is because the id, ego, and superego are not balanced with each other. And the goal of therapy is to bring them back into balance. And this was what makes a healthy-minded individual. Now, having learned what you could call neo-Freudian psychoanalysis from my abnormal psychology class, on that level, I don't have issues with Freud's theory. What I have issues with is classic, or what I could nickname pure or quote-unquote orthodox, classical, if you will, Freudian psychoanalysis, which is essentially reading Freud's books and then saying, I'm going to implement all this without any sort of, consideration to perhaps that he needed to be edited or superseded or abrogated or what have you. There are elements of his theory that, of course, I agree with. The dynamics I agree with. I can see evidence and I can agree with the id, ego, and superego. However, I believe that he was merely scratching the surface of the psyche. This is why I particularly subscribe to analytical psychology, or as it's better known in the mainstream media, Jungian psychology, founded by Carl Gustav Jung. I agree with Jung's theories because I believe he was able to capture more of the totality of not only the psyche, but of our existence as a species and what matters to us on a psychological level. Freud, I believe, was too narrow. He was too much of an absolutist. He was too much of, this is it, this is my way or the highway. And because of his limited understanding of the varieties of human experiences, I believe that's why he came to these very, very abrupt and very narrow conclusions about symbolism, religion, spirituality, human relationships, and things like this. Where I believe he was right is I do think that in childhood we do go through very major experiences that do aid in the development of our personality. Jung himself never, and you can see this on my blog, I wrote a summary of Jung's fourth volume in his collected works entitled Freud and Psychoanalysis, where he has some early papers where he defends Freudian psychoanalysis, and then he moves into slowly criticizing it, and then eventually this is where you can see him leaving it to start his own school of thought. He never denied that childhood and the development of children and infants is important to understanding who we eventually become as far as personality. However, he did not view early childhood development as being strictly sexual. He saw it as being more of a learned, nurturing experience, and not so much this emphasis on infantile sexuality, which I believe that Freud, even if he has basis for this, the fact that this idea therefore means that you become X, Y, and Z in your adulthood, I think it's too simplistic, and I don't see a lot of evidence for it based on my readings of other theories and on his theory. Have I read every single thing by Freud? No. Will I eventually agree with him on other points that I have not yet discovered? Perhaps. And I will gratefully admit those things. But I sincerely think that classical Puritan Freudian psychoanalysis, in my opinion, just doesn't cut it. However, I have corresponded with Freudian Puritan, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but classical Freudian psychoanalysis, people who are in that field, and I have corresponded with individuals who are going through training to become more classical practitioners of Freudian theory, and I simply said, and I'll say this to you, that because we know on a scientific research basis that all therapies do work, that if you choose to become a classic Freudian practitioner, or even a neo-Freudian, a practitioner of psychoanalysis, you will help people. If it makes sense to you, Jung was of the opinion that these theories exist because of personality, because the founders of these theories founded a theory that made sense to them based on personality. So Freud's is legitimate because he was Sigmund Freud, and it's legitimate for those who are similar to him as far as personality. So if it makes sense to you, go with it. It will make sense to your patients who actually want to talk about their childhood and perhaps would like to divulge dreams that, from your opinion, may be based completely in sexuality or aggression, and help them with their issues because of the idea that things are simply repressed that usually are sexual in nature. If that works, then power to you. I wish you the best. But yeah, I mean, this is sort of in a nutshell why I don't agree with him 100%. I respect him. I absolutely respect him. I would not have purchased every single one of his books and now reading every single one of his books if I did not find that there was a value in understanding him. He was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century. He is the founder of what we know as modern psychology today, and I have nothing but respect for him, but I do disagree with him on these key points, that I believe that his view of the psyche was and is too narrow. So I believe if you join the ranks of neo-Freudian individuals like Karen Horney or Erich Fromm, even, of course his name is escaping me now, but he he was into developmental psychology. I can't pause this video, so I don't remember his name now. But anyway, he studied, he came up with developmental psychology. He studied the development of personality from when you're born to when you are an elderly individual, and he disagreed with Freud on this emphasis of sexuality as well. He created life stages, and I just don't recall his name now because I haven't studied him in a while. But anyway, those three individuals would be considered neo-Freudians, in that they took Freud's basic skeleton, but they differed with him on many levels. And I find that what I've learned in my abnormal psychology class, what I've learned is that practitioners who deal with specific abnormalities, when they use Freudian theory, do not emphasize sexuality. If we're dealing with a phobia, if we're dealing with anxiety, they're not going to say, oh, it must be a childhood sexual thing. That's not how they approach it. They ask the question, where is the anxiety coming from? If they see that it's coming from the superego because of the dominating, voice saying, don't do this, you're a bad person if you do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, or if it's the id impulse of like, do it, do it, do it, do it, do it, and your ego can't play the middle ground, then that's why you experience anxiety. That's why you may exhibit certain issues. That is where neo-Freudian, non-classical Freudian psychoanalysis is going. On that level, I think it's great. But I think if you are simply going to read Freud's books and say, I'm going to implement all of this stuff without thinking about the ramifications of doing that, then that's where I would disagree, based on my reading of his works. So I hope that answered your question. If you have any more questions for me on my personal thoughts about these subjects, please let me know. So I hope that at least helped get the ball rolling. Thank you for watching. Peace be with you all.